Hey everyone, how's it going? Thank you all very much for coming. I'm really excited, I'm really happy to be here and to be able to talk about something that I feel really passionate about. My name is Sanj. I'm an engineer here at Compare the Market. We've been using AMP on my team for about 18 months or so. That was when we sort of first dipped our toes in the pool, so to speak. You know, we hard-coded some pages and we saw how things turned out. And in the last 6 months or so, we've been heavily invested in AMP. We've been doing a lot of stuff with it. Now, I'm personally more of a web developer, I'm more of a front-ender. I really love JavaScript. And so when I was told you need to start getting good at AMP and you can't write JavaScript in it, I sort of freaked out. I was like, what do you mean? But actually, it's not so bad. It's all good. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Now, what is AMP? AMP is Google Accelerated Mobile Pages project. It's an open source project. It's been around since the end of 2015. It's got something like 500 contributors or so, more than that, three of whom are on our team alone. Now, what is the problem that they're trying to solve? Their motto is fast by default, and their mantra is user first. So they want to put the user first and sacrifice everything else. The issue is we're in a place now with web development where the average 3G mobile page loads in about 15 seconds, according to Google. And also, according to Google, the average user, or more than half of our users, will drop off, will bounce after about 3.5 seconds. So that's a huge gap, and that's a huge problem. That's a problem in mobile, and that's the problem that AMP tried to solve. Now, it says accelerated mobile pages, and that's where the project started off. It started to solve problems for mobile, but quickly it graduated from that. And now, really, it's accelerated web pages, but they haven't figured out how to change the name yet. So what is AMP? So there's two main components to it. First and foremost, there's the JavaScript side of it. So AMP is sort of like HTML components or web components, if you're familiar with those. We write it using HTML, or we could call it AMP HTML. So in order to use those, we need a couple of things. One, we need the AMP runtime, which is there at the very top. Sorry, this is very small. We're going to go more into depth into stuff. The AMP runtime just runs in a web worker and provides a platform for all the other AMP components to run on, and also the platform to manage resource loading, because that's the biggest problem, really. And as well as that runtime, we also need individual scripts to load in for each of the libraries that we want to use. The second part of it is, of course, the AMP HTML. This is how we would actually write stuff. So it looks just like custom HTML with like attributes and this and that. With those two things alone, we can sort of treat AMP like a component library. If you want to look at it that way, you can use it in isolation. You can combine it with other stuff on your page to get good results from like components that have been built with open source and been designed to be really, really performant. But now, the next part of it is the AMP cache here. So if we go beyond using it like a component library and start to follow their rules, then we get what's called a valid AMP page, and then Google will agree to host our page in their own CDN. So they cache our pages. And there's a little bit more magic that happens as well. So now, what are those rules? What are the restrictions? So some of them are that there's some HTML that is not allowed. Primarily things which will block loading of the page, or things that want to load lots and lots of resources, or things that could cause reflows of the DOM. But there's also replacement components for things that do that. There's a 50 kilobyte CSS limit, and all the CSS has to go into one custom style tag at the very top. We can't use important, we can't target AMP selectors by and large, and there's some other rules as well. And the real kicker is that we can't really write JavaScript, but there are some exceptions to this that we'll go into. So why follow these rules? What is the actual effect of this? Now, I'm very sorry to disappoint you, but this one slide is refusing to animate. If it did animate, on the left what you would see is one of our AMP pages which loads on a 3G connection in about 2.5 seconds, which is pretty good on a 3G. One of our comparable non-AMP pages in the same environment loads in about 4 to 8 seconds, which is not bad, but that's a huge gap, and that's the wrong side of that 50% bounce rate that we're trying to get on the right side of. Now in 4G conditions, that AMP page will load almost instantly. I mean, in less than a second. We're talking about a fraction of a second, which is insanely good, which is why we're so highly invested in it. It's a tool that solves a certain problem for us. So we talked about the cache. Now this is one half of the magic. So Google will cache our pages on their own CDNs, and then when we search via Google search, we'll actually be served up. It'll look like it's our URL, but it'll actually be Google's own cached URL. And this is the second part of the magic. This is the AMP viewer. The AMP viewer is another open source project that they have. And essentially, it allows you to partially preload, partially prefetch resources that it'll predict that you're looking for. You'll see AMP viewer in a lot of different places. You'll probably experience AMP viewer if you use Reddit or Medium or Twitter, Instagram, things like that. Even Facebook, who have instant articles, I think they're called, which was a precursor to AMP. Even now, Facebook have started using AMP on their platform. And the good news for us is that the AMP viewer is embedded in Google search. So on mobile, it gives us huge, huge gains. This is an example of some of the markup that we can use. Like most of your typical HTML is perfectly fine. You can go ahead and use it. There's some that aren't okay, mainly things that have to load resources, and there are AMP replacements for those. And the style and the script tag, unfortunately, we can't really use them as freely as we want to. There are some exceptions. With the script tag, with the script tag, you can store state and data, but you can't really do all that fancy, beautiful JavaScript stuff that we want to do. So let's get into some of the components. I'm going to show you some of the components, and then we're going to look at the future of AMP. So this is an example of the AMP replacement for an image tag. It looks very similar. You can see we've got a source, we've got an alt, and now the layout, width, and height. This is where it's part of the magic of our AMP starts, because when we want to give it an external resource that we want to load, that's fine, but it wants to know how to lay it out on the page so that it can give a user an instant and really consistent experience. So with layout, there's several different types of layout. With responsive layout, sorry, I'll start again. So with layout, usually the width and the height there are going to be pixels. They're not always mandatory. Sometimes AMP can infer the size and position of the elements. But in cases where it can't, then you need to explicitly state them. In the case of a responsive layout, it will responsively scale. So those width and height are actually just aspect ratios. So it could be the exact pixel dimensions, or it could just be like 1.5 to 1. And this is just the output of that HTML. That's what it would look like. You just get a little image at the top of your page. And here we have an example of some of the common attributes that components can have. So we have fallback and no script here. So almost all AMP components will support a fallback and no script tag. So if in the client you just can't support it, then there's a safe fallback. And if there's simply no scripts allowed, then you can defer to your regular image tag. Here we have AMP video. So here we see we've got our fallback, and we've also got something really interesting. We've got a separate source type. So if, for example, we want to use an HLS video as our main source at the very top, but the client is unable to support it, you can gracefully degrade down through a series of sources to finally find one that the client is happy to use. That's just an example of what that would look like. And now we have a whole bunch of proprietary components. So because it's open source, you can go in there. A third party can go in there, and if they can make a good case for a component to be built, and the community is okay with it, then it's fine. And of course, there are big partners that Google is happy to sort of cooperate with. YouTube's one of them. Here we see how we would implement a YouTube embed in a page, and we have a placeholder AMP image that can be shown before our video actually loads up. These are just a couple of other examples. We've got Facebook and Twitter, and this is what that would look like. Now we have an AMP carousel. This is one of the many layout type of components. So we can use layout as an attribute on elements to tell AMP how to position individual elements, or we have a lot of these really helpful container elements. That carousel is one of them that lives in the layout family. And this will just decide how to lay out all its children. So here, for example, we have a layout of type fixed height, so it just knows it's a height of 300 pixels, and it'll responsively scale to the width of the device. And you can have any type of markup you want in there. I've just chosen an AMP image, a paragraph, and an AMP video. Pretty straightforward, it works. And because I've told it to be a slide type, and I've told it to autoplay after a delay of 3,000 milliseconds, that's the effect that we get. And now let's start to see how we do some more fun stuff. So here we have AMP form. Now technically in the markup you can write this as a form if you want, but you can't use a regular form or an AMP form without first including the AMP form JavaScript, the library, sorry. And now a form is a really, really good way. So here firstly we can actually individually handle the success and the error states depending on what the postback to that form is. And also if you wanted to like send data analytics from your front end sneakily, wrapping it in a form is really probably the best way to do it. And you can, depending on whether you want to have an action XHR attribute or just a simple action attribute, you can either trigger just an update of the page or a full refresh if you wanted. Now let's get into some of the more dynamic components. This is one that isn't really going to set the world alight, but it just like blew my mind when I saw it a couple of weeks ago. It's AMP time ago. It's just a really cool little component. It does like really simple thing. You just give it a date time, and it'll tell you like how long ago in the past that was, or how long in the future that is. You know. So the next time I have to implement this, implement something like this somewhere, I don't have to use a massive library from somewhere of some kind, or I don't have to write my own JavaScript. I'm probably just going to use AMP time ago. If it was up to me, this would be everywhere on our website. I love it. And now we have AMP list. So this is a way of getting data from either hard-coded JSON that you have within your solution or an external API. And here we see we're hitting this endpoint, and we've got a placeholder here. So while we wait for our response to come back, we've just hard-coded a delay of 1,000 milliseconds there. We're just going to show this placeholder. And then once the data actually comes back, then we can go to AMP's templating system, which is AMP Mustache. So many of you are probably going to be, I'm sure all of you are familiar with templating, and many of you might be familiar with like mustache.js or handlebars, something like that. It's very similar. It's a very logicless, simple sort of templating syntax, but it's quite useful for what it does. You can be quite creative with it. And this is an example of how we would just sort of go through that. So it would just iterate through each one of our bits of data and just give us this markup with these variables sort of put in. And AMP actually has its own loading state, but because we've told it to use no loading, because we've used our own custom CSS to sort of style the loading state how we want it to be. But this is how it looks, and it looks fine, looks great. Now, one of the primary things that we'd probably use JavaScript for is to handle events. So that's a bit of an issue, but about a year ago now, I guess, AMP introduced events and actions, which is what this is. So this would be the syntax. This is just an HTML attribute, and we're saying on the event X, to target Y, do the optional action Z with optional arguments. And you can see here we've used the tap event. The tap event would be the simplest way to sort of recreate a click event handler. And that target would be the ID of your component, or you can also target the AMP runtime to do some clever things like navigate or set state, stuff like that. And now we're going to get into AMP bind. AMP bind was released not too long ago, and it's like a huge, huge leap for AMP. This is like, well, basically like data binding, and we can use state, and we can use expressions. So this is an example of like how we would use state. We can have multiple mutable state objects in our DOM. It's not a problem. They're all referenced via the ID, and they just use a JSON-like syntax. And next we have our event handler there, and within here you can see in bold, I don't know how easy that is to see, but in bold we're using expression there. So we can't use JavaScript, but they've provided us a subset of JavaScript that we can use, and that's just a really, really simple example to craft an endpoint that'll hit a random point in the Star Wars API. And then finally we have binding here. So this surrounded in the square brackets, there are a bunch of common attributes to a lot of elements. But there are some which you can bind to. So basically anything that's bound. In this element down here, it will have this text in it to begin with, and then on user interaction, the state gets updated, and then bind kicks in. So bind will then go and look at the state.name and replace the text with that. And that's what that looks like. So we've seen a small selection of components, but I'm going to show you a couple of pages that use really just the components that we've been talking about by and large. About 99% of this is only what we've been speaking about. And you can see you can get, this is an example of like a commerce site, AliExpress I think it is. And you can see there's really a pretty good experience. These are all valid AMP pages that load almost instantly. So now if we just watch the very top of the screen there, there's a little header there, which when we scroll down, that's going to collapse. Now that's achieved by the AMP position observer component, which on their side, they've placed it just below the fold, and as soon as you trigger that action, it'll know to trigger an animation which collapses that little header. This is an example of the evening standard. So you can see we also benefit here by that top little carousel there, which will feature AMP stories. So if we search for a certain subject like Trump or Kanye West or something, we would get stories from many different publishers appear in that carousel. But because we search for a specific website, Evening Standard, it populates the AMP carousel with only Evening Standard AMP links. And you can see here we've harnessed the power of the AMP viewer to preemptively predict 3 AMP navigations forward in time. And when you encounter new potential AMP navigations, it'll push old ones out of the stack to try and keep everything nice and efficient. Now we're going to look at one of the really clever components that we have called AMP Story. So AMP Story really is something completely new, completely different. This was a solution that they wanted to make for like content publishers, magazines and newspapers and the like. In order to be able to tell like really rich, interactive, media, sort of magazine layout, fun digital story type things. And you can see we've got a like, little progress bar at the top there. And this is just a hello world example of what we can do. Now, let's look at a couple of really nice, shiny examples. So here on the left, we have an article from People magazine about the royal family. And you can see this harnesses all of the potential of layout and animation that's all built in with AMP Story. And then there on your right, you'll see the desktop experience. So AMP Story is not really built to be viewed in landscape view, and it's not built to expand adaptively or responsively. That's the UX that we'll get. And I've worked on a little bit with the AMP team, and they're pretty adamant that they're not going to move from that UX for now. So is that really the end of JavaScript for AMP? Not really. There's stuff we can do now, and there's stuff we might be able to do in the future. So now we can use AMP iframe. So those act like a regular iframe that you might use, but there are some restrictions, like it can't be in the top 3/4 of the initial viewport, only so that the user can be guaranteed a really consistent and fast experience without having to wait for resources. But you can see that it does a lot of what we would want to do, and if you wanted to write custom interactive JavaScript, you can serve it up to an AMP iframe and it would load and work just fine in a valid AMP page. The only criteria would be that you need to give it a placeholder that takes up the exact same dimensions. And this is an example of a Netflix iframe and a Google Maps. We also have AMP install service worker. So when your AMP page loads, this installs a service worker, which then can do all that beautiful magical stuff that we use service workers for. So what they call this is PWAMP, Progressive Web AMP. The name is really ridiculous, but the concept is pretty cool. So a user does a Google search or whatever, they go via Facebook or Reddit or Twitter, they want to click your link, they come to your page, it's an instant load, they're like, wow, this is amazing. Then they're surfing a page and in the meantime you use the service worker to load up the rest of what you need so you can make the future journey through your own domain as efficient as possible. And there's also, they announced in February of this year at AmpConf in Amsterdam, they announced a proposal that they want to make our lives easier. They want to make us all love AMP. So they know that one of our major pain points as developers is that why can't we write JavaScript? So what they've proposed is that maybe they'll let us use Preact to write off main thread JavaScript. So JavaScript that can't block the main thread, but it still gives us a bit of flexibility. This is all work in progress, and they haven't guaranteed that they're going to let us do this, but the option is there. It might happen. And like I mentioned, it's open source. We contribute. From what I've seen, they're very friendly and they're very open to helping people contribute. So if you want to make something happen in AMP, if there's something that you don't like we found a bug about a month ago, and it was a pain point for us. We opened an issue, and a couple of days later, they agreed that it affected UX, and they assigned it to someone, and there was a lot of communication going on, and 2 weeks later, there was a PR merged in, and 3 days later, it was live. So we've had a great experience with it. And thanks, that's actually all my talk. These are some resources that I use to learn about AMP and to figure out how to use it and what else it can sort of do. So that's a good starting point. And we also have an AMP meetup coming up in a few weeks that we're hosting at CNN. I'm going to be talking, someone from CNN is going to be talking more in depth about AMP Story, and we've got someone from Google speaking about really, really advanced, deep interactivity, taking a little bit of what I'm showing you and go really in depth with it to solve some really difficult problems. So I've tweeted about it. I don't have many tweets, so actually if you go to my Twitter, you'll find a link to that meetup if you want to come join us. And that's all. Thank you so much for listening.